So here from the Master Maitreya, from the ornament for the sutras, to begin with a quote from that. Here he says that if you're not skilled in the five sciences, then there's no way that even Arya beings, superior beings, can become omniscient. So therefore, we need to train ourselves in those five sciences. So when we're thinking about how it is that we attain the state of Buddhahood, in order to do so, we need to train in the perfection of wisdom, bring that to its culmination. And training in the perfection of wisdom means developing these three types of wisdom, basically. The first type being the wisdom realizing the ultimate. Then there is the wisdom realizing conventional things, understanding conventional or the phenomenal, as well as the kind of wisdom that understands how to engage in the sort of benefit for others. So here, that first type, the wisdom realizing the ultimate, is referring to the wisdom realizing emptiness. And here, the wisdom of the conventional includes the trainings in the five sciences. So we need to train in these in order to be able to eventually benefit others and reach that state of Buddhahood. So training in the five sciences, the first of those is grammar, understanding letters and words and how we put those together. This is something that we need to understand as a basis for ourselves, as well as be able to teach to others such that they are able to engage with words and understand them. And that alone, though, is not sufficient. We don't just want to be able to sort of engage with words and just sort of know their surface meaning, but then we need to train in the kind of science of logic and reasoning. So the second science is like dialectics or logic, wherein we are able to evaluate the things that we are reading and hearing and understanding in order to see, is this something that has a reason behind it? Is this something that is valid? And be able to find those kinds of valid sources and valid reasons in order to establish things. Again, to reach Buddhahood, we need to develop these kinds of sciences or learning in order to perfect our perfection of wisdom. So here, again, moving beyond just the kind of those first two of the logic, the sort of science of grammar and logic, there's also the kind of, the science of building or sort of craftsmanship, those kinds of things that we can build and develop for the benefit of others. So knowing things like how to build roads or cars, those sorts of things that we use in society in order to meet the temporary needs of people, to alleviate their kind of temporary suffering. So everything from knowing how to build houses to food and agriculture and those kinds of sciences, those are needs that beings have. And to fulfill those kinds of temporary needs, one should be trained in that science as well, the kind of crafts and arts. As well, one needs to have training in medicine. So knowing how to kind of protect against untimely death, to protect the vitality and health of others, training in medical sciences, not just to be able to sustain our own body and health, but to be able to help others and protect them against that kind of suffering. This as well is one of the five sciences. And then finally, the fifth is sort of the inner science, the science of working with our own mind. How do we tame our own mind? So developing things like the understanding of emptiness and the understanding of compassion and bodhicitta and so forth, how we remove our faults and develop good qualities. All of those kinds of trainings are included within that sort of inner sciences. So bodhisattvas engage in these sciences, in these sorts of learnings, and it is indispensable to proceed to Buddhahood. And so it'll come farther down in this quotation from the ornament for the sutras, but there are these two words, those bodhisattvas who are on the path of accumulation and the path of preparation, we say, are sort of engaging in those the trainings of those sciences, whereas bodhisattvas on the path of seeing and above are sort of already engaged or sort of entered into in a more kind of concrete way. Hmm. So then included with the kind of science of arts and crafts, we can include the kind of science or learning in terms of business, how we do get the goods to people who need them, as well as kind of agriculture and those sorts of sciences that are necessary to feed us and support us. So among, again, these three types of wisdom, we need to sort of train in all of them, including the kind of wisdom that is engaging in the benefit of others. So knowing how to benefit others in a way that doesn't have any kind of non-virtue attached to it. This is something that bodhisattvas, this kind of training in these sciences is indispensable for bodhisattvas. So, the reason, sort of what I'm explaining here, where it is talking in the ornament for the sutra, is about how bodhisattvas, even like all the way up to the point of Buddhahood, they need to train in these various sciences. And so it's not like when we think about sort of bodhisattvas, we might think that they're in meditative equipoise, and that's when they're really doing their practice. But it's actually the case that they come out of that period of meditative equipoise where they're accumulating all of this, the sort of accumulation of wisdom, and they engage in the accumulation of merit through various practices in those periods of subsequent attainment. They engage in generosity and patience and so forth. And so here, I guess what I'm trying to really say, is that a bodhisattva, again, whatever they are doing is held with that attitude of bodhicitta. Thus, they are, whatever kind of actions they engage in go toward the benefit of others. And so often we sort of think of our Dharma practice as something separate, like we're out living in society and that's kind of our non-dharmic activity. And then we go do Dharma by sitting on a cushion and maybe saying our prayers or doing kind of meditation. But we really shouldn't see it as separate in that way. The times that we are sitting on our cushion and meditating and saying prayers are in order to be able to practice the Dharma when we are interacting with others in society. And so we need to have that kind of recognition that whatever we are doing, we should do with a positive kind of intention. Whatever kind of activity engaging in society, we should wish that all of the actions of our body, speech, and mind be in accord with the Dharma, be virtuous by way of our motivation. So here, it's often, there's a sutra in which the Buddha says that the first sort of auspiciousness, the kind of good and auspiciousness begins at home by having respect and love for one's own parents. When we are able to have that kind of love and respect toward others within our own family, where we recognize that they are beings who experience suffering and experience happiness, we don't see them as just like things who don't have feelings, but rather we are able to see them as beings who are living and breathing and having feelings. And we develop that kind of attitude of love and compassion for them. It is in that way. It starts with the family and can expand out from that. That's how we really generate that kind of goodness and auspiciousness. And so we should make this effort to act virtuously, make whatever kinds of activities we do virtuous through that kind of intention. So usually we might think like, well, what's the difference between Dharma and non-Dharma? It's really what did we set our intention to? If we make our intention one that is virtuous, that whatever kind of work we may be doing, whether we're working in a factory or doing some kind of business, or whether we're doing agriculture, if we do it with that kind of intention of, oh, I'm doing this for the benefit of others, then it becomes virtuous. Whereas if we are doing it with this sort of attitude of, oh, this is, I want to just get my paycheck, or I want this just for myself, our acts then become non-virtuous. So here it is in this way that whatever we are doing can become a kind of practice of Dharma, can become a virtuous sort of thing. So, we should recognize that bodhisattvas can be anywhere. There could be a bodhisattva working in a factory. There are bodhisattvas working in fields. They are making effort. Whatever sort of actions they are doing are done for the benefit of others. And that's really what makes a bodhisattva. We see that there are passages that describe once a bodhisattva has given rise to this attitude of bodhicitta, it's never ceasing, such that even if they were to say get a little bit drunk or fall asleep, their virtues are never ending. That kind of attitude, that intention carries forward no matter what they are doing. So we really should make this kind of effort to have a good motivation, such that whatever acts we are doing on a regular basis are really done with a good mind, done pride, without anger, without attachment. And in that way, we are happier. Others around us are happier. We're healthier, and so forth. So this is if it bodhisattvas need to do, we too should try to emulate those kinds of practices of bodhisattvas and make whatever it is that we do a virtuous practice through being infused with that kind of intention. So here we can take just a small example of if we think about, like, say, the activity of just cleaning the area around us. If we clean the area around us, the environment around us with a kind of good attitude and a good motivation, we actually can sort of like purify our own mind and the minds of others who see that sort of environment. And we're actually also creating the kind of conditions, the kind of causes to experience a pure environment in the future, even being born in a pure land and so forth. And so it's really, we should think about the kind of impact of having that sort of attitude, having that kind of motivation, even for doing some sort of small action, can have a very large result. And so here, when it comes to the most basic of practices, beginning with our own family, we should think that we are going to, in all ways, abandon harming others and work to benefit others as much as we can. Really, all Dharma is contained within these two. The sort of wish for others to have happiness, wanting to benefit them, as well as the wish that they be freed from their suffering, not wanting them to experience any kind of harm. When we give rise to those kinds of attitudes, we end up sort of expanding them more and more, such that we give rise to this kind of love that wants others to not just have happiness, but have the happiness that is the stable, lasting happiness of Buddhahood. And we wish that others might be freed from their suffering, and expanding that more and more to include all other sentient beings, and also not just their temporary kinds of sufferings, but this all of the sufferings of samsara, of taking rebirth again and again. We wish for them to be able to have that kind of state of freedom. So all dharmas, all practices are really directly or indirectly contained within those two. This basic of abandoning harming others and wishing to benefit them. The kind of practices of like equanimity, not holding some close and others distant. Even the idea of emptiness and how we get to that state of freedom and so forth. All of this is contained within those two. So here, if we're thinking about training in the Dharma, we have to do so in a way that actually has an impact on our conduct when we engage with others. So we shouldn't sort of like when we are sitting on our cushion be generating love and compassion and so forth, but then when we go out in society and meet people, we're just fighting with them, and we have jealousy and anger and so forth. It's like in the way that, say, soldiers, they train to be able to go into battle. They learn all of these different skills such that when they go out and they're actually in battle, they use them. And we are sort of in the same way. We are training in love and compassion and all of these various attitudes in order that we might use them when we are out engaging with people. It's not sort of like something that we should be thinking that is somehow separate from our everyday life. So ideally, when we wake up in the morning, we should have the first sort of thought that we go through should be setting our intention that with our body, speech, and mind, we're not going to harm any others, and we're going to work as much as we can to benefit them. And so we do this, sort of set that attitude, hold it throughout the day, ideally by going for refuge and generating this attitude of bodhicitta, going for refuge, recognizing the Buddha as being this undeceptive teacher, and the Dharma is something that you have confidence in, that if you give rise to this Dharma within your own mind stream, you too can attain that state of Buddhahood, as well as looking at the Sangha, those that are training in this path and wanting to emulate them. So here, again, we should, at the beginning of the day, set that kind of intention, generating this attitude of refuge and bodhicitta. And then during the day, try to hold on to that ideally. And at the end of the day, think like, well, what did I actually do over the course of the day? Who did I fight with? What kind of mean words did I say? And try to purify, confess and purify those negativities, as well as rejoice in those kinds of positive things that we have done. And so it is in this way that we're able to, over time, improve and really benefit from the Dharma. We need to train in these kinds of practices. Otherwise, it's like we can just hear this over and over again, but we're not actually using it to benefit ourselves in any way. We just are kind of hearing the teachings and allowing it to be some sort of knowledge, but not something that we really apply in our lives. So we should have this kind of attitude of thinking that whatever sort of activities I'm going to do, even a sort of as in the way that even bodhisattvas up to the very highest of grounds do all kinds of different activities for the benefit of other beings. Whatever it is that I'm going to do, I'm going to do with this attitude of wishing to benefit others, trying to give rise to this wish that I might become a fully enlightened Buddha, one who has completed the sort of accumulation of merit and wisdom, who has fully perfected the methods and fully perfected wisdom, such that he is able to teach undeceivingly what it is that we should adopt and abandon, that knows kind of all of the points that we are to practice and so forth, and is in that way fully able to benefit other sentient beings. So here again, as we sort of set our motivation for listening to the teachings, we should think that we're striving to attain that state of Buddhahood. And it's not with the sort of short-sightedness of just thinking about this life or even just a few lives into the future, but recognizing that this subtle mental continuum will go on after we cast off this body and the next. And so with that kind of long-term thinking that however long it may take, I wish to attain this state of Buddhahood, complete perfect enlightenment, in order to be able to fully benefit other sentient beings. And with that kind of motivation, we should set that kind of motivation for listening to the teachings. So here, as for where we had left off, what we had been talking about was sort of the views that arose of earlier Tibetan masters. Where here there are some that would say that like, for example, if you don't sort of find the thing when one is engaging in ultimate analysis and one can't find whatever thing is designated, there are those that would say that that means that even conventional things are sort of totally non-existent. And now here, when it comes to Lama Tsongkhapa, he differentiates in this idea that one isn't negating the thing itself, but rather this kind of independent existence, or existence from its own side, some kind of inherent existence, other than something being designated by mind. If there is some sort of existence from the side of the object, that is what is being negated here. So when it comes to, we can see that the sort of tradition of exegesis of things like the Heart Sutra and Nagarjuna's texts and the masters like Chandrakirti and Aryadeva, there are terms that they use, and then we see that there are terms that get sort of applied by later Tibetan masters, or by various sort of different masters, and they might differ slightly, but we should have a good way. We need to be able to understand what the intended meaning is there. And so this depends upon being able to differentiate between things that are provisional, that need some kind of interpretation, versus things that are definitive. So here, Panchen Losang Chögyен, in his text, his root text on the Gelu tradition of Mahamudra, has a section where he talks about, he says, so from the point of view of individually ascribed names, there are numerous different traditions. We can talk about these sort of things like the simultaneously arising as merged, the amulet box, possessing five, and he lists off these sort of various practice, these names, these terms, the 6 spheres of equal taste, the 4 syllables, the pacifier, the object to be cut off, Dzogchen, the discursive Madhyamaka view, and so on. Nevertheless, when scrutinized by a yogi learned in scripture and logic and experienced in meditation, their definitive meanings are all seen to come to the same point. So here, this isn't just sort of a matter of saying, like, closing your eyes and saying, oh yeah, everything's good. But a yogi, someone who's actually learned in the scriptures and has a kind of experience with meditation, can understand that even though there might be different words or terms that are employed, that doesn't necessarily indicate a difference in the same intended meaning, what it is really trying to get at. The things are spoken in provisional ways for an intended purpose, for a reason. And so one who understands that well is able to see that things can be actually trying to come to the same sort of definitive or point. So too, it can be the case that there's a single word, the same sound, but people take it in very different ways, can be understood in totally different kind of connotations. So here, there are different sort of teachings that are given, maybe to pacify one's anger or to pacify attachment or for particular purposes. But a yogi who's very much skilled in scripture and logic knows that they're all kind of coming to the same point. So here, when it comes to the kind of presentation of Lama Tsongkhapa, here, when he's talking about whether there is a self or there's no self and so forth, when we are coming to understand this idea of no self, we need to sort of have an idea of how that I appears to us. So normally when we have this sense of I or this self, it's something connected with our five aggregates, our form, our feeling, our discrimination, mental consciousness, as well as our sort of karmic formations. It appears in a way as though it has some sort of like autonomous or independent existence. It's not as though the self appears to us as something that is merely designated on that basis of those aggregates, but rather we have this way in which the I appears to us as though it were like autonomous or independent in any way of our mental labeling and designation. So really, it's only independence upon designating on the aggregate that we can say like, oh, that's Tashi or that's Tundrup. But when we search for them within that basis, we can't actually find that person. It doesn't exist in the way that it appears to us. So here, when it comes to the kind of way that the I normally appears to us, this is what we need to investigate and analyze. See how it is that we have this sense of an I as though it had some kind of inherent existence or autonomous, independent existence. It is by negating that I as it appears to us that we benefit our mind. It is the way that everything appears to us, all kind of pleasant or unpleasant objects, our friends, our enemies, they all appear to exist in this way, rather than the fact that they're like designated on many parts. Like when we think something like house, it appears like there's a house there from its own side, not depending upon our mentally designating it on this collection of parts, like the walls and the ceiling and the windows and so forth. And so we need to have that kind of a good understanding, have identified and recognized how it is that things normally appear to us, in order to be able to understand their emptiness of that kind of inherent existence. So in his text called Recognizing My Mother, that by Chankya Ropwe Dorje, he gives a kind of explanation of the way that we can go astray with this. So he says, there seem to be among today's scholars some caught in a web of words like thoroughly withstanding and true existence. And so there are those who, rather than actually sort of looking at the way that things appear to them, looking at that actual appearance, they instead get sort of caught up in the terms of like something that could withstand analysis or something that's truly existent. And they leave the way that things actually appear to them in this way, just sort of how it is. And it's like they're searching for something else, somewhere else to negate as the object of negation. So here, I'll just read the rest of the verse. It says, again, so there seem to be among today's scholars some caught in a web of words like thoroughly withstanding and true existence, who seek to negate some creature with horns, while leaving in fact intact this everyday appearance of solidity. And so this is, we need to be able to recognize the way that things actually appear to us. We can't just sort of leave the way that things appear as though they were inherently or autonomously existent, and then kind of search for something that is the lack of true existence or emptiness out over there, while just leaving the appearance of things like our friends and our enemies, pleasant and unpleasant objects. So here it's important, again, when we are negating this sort of self, that it is a self that has that kind of independent, autonomous existence that isn't dependent upon our mentally designating it. But that kind of not finding such such a self doesn't negate the existence of a dependently designated, dependently originated self. That kind of self does exist, but we need to examine the way in which it exists to us and actually negate that kind of false appearance rather than search for something else as the object of negation. So here then to start out with the actual text, sort of giving the kind of preface to this text that is understanding reality by means of this teaching of dependent origination. So here, the sort of a reasoning of dependent origination. This is the kind of a logic or reasoning that can lead to all of the different kinds of understandings. So when it comes to the kind of knowledge of the base, the path, and the result, all of these things can be understood, including impermanence and selflessness. They can all be understood through the logic, the understanding of dependent origination. Now, again, this is something where we shouldn't sort of understand it as like a type of story or something that's out there or over there that's not applicable to actual reality. But rather, we need to understand dependent arising as the things that, the way that things actually are. So this is a kind of foundational understanding that allows us to gain understanding of other topics and reasons. So here to begin then from the first chapter that's giving the purpose of giving the name dependent arising, or how to seek reality by means of the Buddha's teachings on dependent arising. So here it says the sage, the Buddha, is regarded as the unsurpassed teacher or guru of all beings because he understood and taught the way of dependent arising through his own direct experience. So here, the sort of sage, what is being translated as the sage, is really referring to this kind of attainment of the Buddha. The Buddha has gained this supreme attainment, made all of his body, speech, and mind completely pure, and in this way is sort of the has attained this supreme kind of attainment. And he did this through his own understanding, of dependent arising and through his own direct experience. So there were previously various Hindu schools, including those that say looked to the Vedas as an authoritative source. That was something that they would base all of their kind of understanding on. And as opposed to that, the Buddha taught this teaching of dependent origination based upon his own kind of realization. He didn't depend upon some sort of text or something that was seen as being authoritative, but rather through his own development of wisdom and through his own experience, understood this way of dependent arising, and thus was able to teach this to others. So it is independence upon the Buddha's understanding of looking at the fact that all compounded phenomena arise due to causes and conditions, and even those things that are uncompounded are dependent upon their various parts, the whole upon the parts, and they are dependent upon our mentally labeling and designated. So here, those kinds of, when we look at things arising from causes and conditions, that level of kind of dependent origination, we can see that there's that level of being causal as well as being dependent of the parts, sorry, the whole on the parts and parts on the whole, as well as dependent on our mentally labeling or designating things. So when it comes to things arising causally, we can think about the substantial cause. That is the sort of thing that is the real sort of like if we have, for example, a seed gives rise to a sprout. That seed is the substantial cause, and all of the coordinating conditions are the soil and the water and so forth. And so it is then by way of this kind of understanding that the Buddha gained, that he then taught this to other sentient beings. So the Buddha perceived that all living beings are afflicted with a variety of problems because, as an initial cause, they misconceive the way things are. And so, motivated by the wish to show precisely the ontological status of all things in order to completely free all beings from these problems, the teacher, the Buddha, revealed the truth of dependent arising. So here, the word that Geshe is using in the Tibetan is sort of that for living beings is goers. I mean, the reality is we are going, we are cycling, taking up one kind of existence and going into another. And so really the Buddha looks at this situation of all sentient beings such that they are the initial cause that leads to this kind of cycling is they're misconceiving the way that things are, the way that we see, the way that all things that we see and perceive all various objects and hear sounds and smell and so forth is in a way that we misconceive those objects. And thus, due to the kind of elaboration of our wrong thoughts, we create all of the kinds of problems. All of the various faults come from this. And so to show the way that we are mistaken, the Buddha gives this teaching on dependent arising, reveals the truth of dependent arising in order to help those beings. So we can see that all of, like, for example, dependent origination can establish that things are impermanent because they come about only in dependence upon causes and conditions. There's that recognition that they are impermanent. They are subject to causes and conditions. And we can see too that they are interdependently originated in the sense of things are based upon or are dependent upon their basis of designation, the whole on the parts, and so forth. And so the Buddha, recognizing this as being the sort of fundamental cause of being sufferings, taught dependent origination in order that they might be freed from those. So here, continuing, it says, the main cause of all the troubles in the world is our ignorance. And this is twofold. First, we do not precisely understand the dependent arising of causes and effects. In other words, how effects depend upon their respective causes for their production. So here, we don't always have a clear, good idea of the relationship between cause and effect. We want to have happiness. We don't want to suffer. But as Shantideva has said, it ends up being the case that we basically destroy all of the causes of our happiness and end up, even though we don't want suffering, running towards it because we're creating all of the causes for our future suffering. So here, we generally have this sense of like a strong sense of an I. And then out of that strong sense of I, we want happiness for that I. We want all good things from that. And that's really the source of all of these various faults that we develop, all of the kinds of things like non-virtues that we engage in is really from that fundamental misapprehension and not understanding that we are in reality creating the causes of suffering rather than creating the causes for our happiness. So if we really had a good understanding, we would not create those kinds of bad causes, those things that would lead to our future suffering, but would instead only create those kinds of good causes. So here, when we that is one of the kinds of ways in which we are ignorant, in terms of ignorant of the we don't understand dependent arising of causes and effects. And then secondly, we do not think about how things derive their respective identities and become an object of the mind merely by our imputing a term or concept onto their parts, their so-called basis of imputation. So here, when it comes to like looking at the nature of any sort of object that arises to us, the I, the self, a house, our friends, our family, all of our craving, the world, all of these various things, they are designated in dependence upon a particular basis of designation. There needs to be this basis, this arising or appearance in order to do that kind of designation. It's not like if you just have like an empty space, you can't talk about anything. You can't, there's nothing on which you can designate a particular object. Like when it comes to a person, when we say, oh, there's that person over there, it's independence upon seeing, say, their form aggregate or the collection of the the aggregates that we designate, like say maybe it's how they walk. There's a certain sort of movement of that form, and on that basis we say, oh, that's that person. Or on the basis of hearing their voice, we're able to say, oh, that's that person, and we designate in that way. And so the kind of thing, like when we say experience the suffering of being sick, it's only in dependence upon having that negative feeling or whatever it is that we are able to say, I'm sick. Everything in this way is dependently designated. It's not just sort of dependent upon cause and effect, but it's also the case that everything, our self, our house, all objects are merely designated and imputed by, as it says here, term and concept. So when it comes to, we can sort of designate with a thought, with that kind of concept, and then we can also use the various terms. So it seems like when we say have a house, that there's something that appears from the side of that that isn't dependent upon our designating on the basis of the collection of walls and windows and roof and so forth, that it's not like we think that that house exists by mere designation, by mere imputation. Rather, it seems to be able to be something that like exists in its own right. But this is the case for everything, like our sense of an eye. It's something that's merely designated on whichever of the aggregates, they're either 4 or 5, or like we think a tree, it's something that's merely designated on that collection of branches and leaves and so forth. So that mere appearance is all that is needed to satisfy existence. Like when we have the thought cow, like we see on the basis of particular form and we designate cow, that designation satisfies existence of a cow. We've established the existence of the cow. But if we think that, oh no, there needs to be something really that's there, that I can point to within the basis of designation, then we sort of run into this problem. It says we think instead that if we searched for what they truly are, these various things, we would be able to find them. So we think that if we could sort of look within that particular basis, we would be able to find that thing. But yet, it's not the case that there's something that like exists independently of that labeling or designating process. Like when we see someone and we think like, oh, they're going along, it seems like that's just something that is happening from its own side. It's not dependent upon our mentally labeling it, mentally designating it. There being some kind of movement that whole and the parts that and the whole that is designated on the parts and so forth. So in this way, we have this sense that there must be something that's really there beyond just sort of the terms that we put on things or the concepts that we use for them. Instead, it really is the case that designation is the extent of existence. There's no sort of existence beyond that. Yeah, we want to search for something that is more solid. This is the way that we are, this second kind of ignorance. So here, for instance, when we each have an ever-present and instinctual notion of I and mine, to which a self appears to exist in its own right, and that assents to this appearance. So here, when it comes to like our own individual self, when we think I, we have this sense of there being something that is not dependent upon that basis of designation, that is not dependent upon our designating with terms and concepts on that particular basis, or like a whole dependent upon parts, or something that is dependent upon causes, but rather it seems like there's something that exists solidly from its own side, that has this kind of autonomous, independent sort of existence. And then based upon that kind of sense of I and grasping at that sense of I, we then give rise to this sense of mine, like my body, my eyes, my ears, my enjoyment, the various possessions and things that I have, the tastes and smells and touches that we interact with, we then grasp at as being mine. And so as Chandrakirti has said in the entry to the middle way, first with the thought I am, they cling to a self. Then with the thought mine, they become attached to things. Like buckets on a water wheel, they turn without control. I bow to the compassion that that cares for such suffering beings. So this is really the way in which this process kind of goes. We think we have this sense of there being an I as really existing like autonomously, independently of any kind of designation. And so too, those things, those possessions that we enjoy, and it appears as though they like had this kind of existence that is not dependent in any way, but they don't actually have that sort of existence. And so for example, there is a drapung, like I guess they like sort of put kind of clothing on these things that from a distance, it looks like there's sort of a big, impressive kind of person. But when you get closer, you can see that it's just like wrapped up in these clothing. You take off the clothes and there's nothing actually there. It appears as like a real being. It appears to us that all of the various things that we interact with and enjoy, and that self, that I that enjoys them, has that kind of real existence from their own side, but they don't actually exist in that way. So that kind of innate mind that grasps at an I, that thought of I and that thought of mine, arise and become then the sort of fundamental cause of all of the various sorts of sufferings that we experience. It is, as Dharmakirti has said in his Pramanavartika, the compendium on valid cognition, that first we think of this I, and then we designate other. And based upon that, we have attachment for our own side and animosity toward the other side. And from that, we engage in all various karmas. Thus, it is from that sense of I that all faults arise. So we divide, like when we think I and mine, we sort of have our side, whether that's based upon, as it continues here, based upon this idea of I and mine, we conceive of things in two groups, like anything associated with ourselves, myself, mine, my family, my race, my country, my religion. We find all of these ways to designate between this sort of self and other, and anything associated with others, that is like everything else. So in this way, based upon this fundamental, instinctual, innate notion of I, and then the mind that arises from that, so too come all of our attachment and animosity from that fundamental mind. Mm. So here, as the Buddha has taught, then when it comes to say the beings of small capacity, it's okay for those beings to hold themselves as most important, to recognize their own happiness as being most important, as wanting to relieve their own suffering more than others, and thinking about their family and so forth. But it's said, the Buddha has said, you can't harm others in the course of trying to accomplish your own happiness. It's okay if at that stage you still hold yourself as most important. You hold your own accomplishments or what you need as most important, your own country, your own family. Okay, that's okay for that to be most important to you, but you can't, maybe at that point, you're not able to sort of give up that self-interest, but at least don't harm anyone else in the course of pursuing your own self-interest. That if you are able to, say, live in your own area and recognize, okay, I want to achieve my happiness, but I'm not going to look at the other who's next to me there in a way that I want to fight with them or be jealous of them or competitive with them. As soon as we get into that, then it's sort of like, when you get into this competitiveness and jealousy and wanting to have more than the other, then you can go into the place where you think, whatever I do, it's okay. It's in order to get my happiness. And so we might be in a position where you are willing to lie and hurt others in order to get what you need. But instead of that, at the very least, we should give up this attitude of thinking that it's okay to harm others. If we can ourselves be happy and look at others and say, may they be happy as well, even if you hold your own happiness as more important. Mm. And so the being of middling scope goes beyond that to see that, well, I shouldn't have attachment or hatred. If I want to get my own kind of freedom from suffering, I need to get rid of that kind of making distinction between self and other, and in that way undermine that kind of grasping at my own happiness and wanting harm to come to others. So recognizing others as like equally wanting happiness and not wanting to suffer, and And in that way, even if you're striving for your own liberation alone, one recognizes the importance of getting rid of attachment and hatred. So here, then again, I don't think I read this last sentence that when we then have attachment for the former and hostility for the latter, and all our other problems ensue. So if you reflect deeply on dependent arising, you will understand that whatever identity things have is established in dependence upon a collection of causes and conditions, as well as on a basis of imputation and imputing terms and concepts. And so here, with this key point, you see that things such as self and other are established by mere conceptualization. And from this, you can easily understand that they lack inherent existence or intrinsic existence. And so here, when it comes to like thinking self and other, we think I, and everything that is not that I is other. But from a perspective of that other, every single individual looks at themselves as I, and everything else is other. It's not as though there's somehow intrinsic existence from the side of that thing that is self, and then those are others. So it is on that basis of holding to a sense of I that we then kind of look down upon others. But there isn't an I or a self that is somehow independent, autonomous, not designated upon a particular basis. Again, it appears to us as though we have this self or this I that's kind of existent in its own right, separate of our designating it or being designated upon a particular basis of imputation with those kind of imputation, with those kinds of terms and concepts. So here, by understanding the way in which things are contingently designated, we can understand that they lack intrinsic existence. The kind of understanding of self and other is kind of like this mountain and that mountain. When we're here on this mountain, it is this mountain, and over there is that mountain. And we go over to that other one, and all of a sudden that is this mountain, and the previous one is that mountain, and so forth. So when it comes to self and other, these kinds of things are established merely by conceptualization. And from this, we can easily understand that they lack any kind of intrinsic existence. They only have a kind of contingent establishment.
Oh, yeah, thank you.